The morning air inside Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station hangs thick with coal smoke and summer heat as you watch President James Garfield stride confidently toward his train, unaware that death walks 30 feet behind him. Quick favor. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is there. It helps us see the global reach of this story. This moment will shatter a presidency and plunge America into constitutional chaos for 79 agonizing days. July 2nd, 1881. The clock above the station platform reads 9:20 in the morning when President James Abram Garfield steps through the ladies' waiting room of Washington's busiest railway terminal. Summer sunlight streams through tall windows, casting long shadows across marble floors worn smooth by countless travelers. The president moves with the easy confidence of a man who has survived both battlefield and political arena, his broad shoulders filling his dark traveling coat. Behind him, Secretary of State James Blaine chatters about their upcoming journey to Williams College, where Garfield plans to deliver commencement remarks and visit his old friend. The president's security detail remains minimal, just a single bodyguard trailing at a respectful distance. After all, who would dare harm America's chief executive in broad daylight? Charles Julius Guiteau knows exactly who would dare. The failed lawyer and religious fanatic has been stalking Garfield for weeks, his fevered mind convinced that killing the president will heal the Republican Party's bitter factional wounds. Guiteau's unwashed clothes reek of cheap boarding house rooms and desperate ambition. His right hand trembles as it grips the ivory-handled British Bulldog revolver hidden beneath his worn coat. The weapon weighs barely 2 pounds, but it carries the power to reshape a nation. What drives a man to believe that murder serves God's purpose? Guiteau's delusional reasoning stems from the vicious political warfare between Republican factions, the stalwarts who demand party loyalty, and the half-breeds who seek civil service reform. Garfield's nomination had balanced these competing forces, but Guiteau, rejected for a diplomatic post, sees betrayal where others see compromise. The station's morning bustle provides perfect cover. Passengers hurry past with luggage and newspapers, their conversations mixing with the distant whistle of approaching trains. Vendors hawk coffee and sweet rolls from wooden carts, their voices echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The familiar sounds of American prosperity mask approaching catastrophe. Garfield pauses near the station's center, turning to respond to something Blaine has said. His profile presents a perfect target: the strong jaw, graying beard, and thoughtful eyes of a man who has led troops through Civil War carnage and emerged as one of America's most promising leaders. At 50, he represents the new generation of Republican leadership, untainted by the corruption scandals that have plagued his predecessors. Guiteau steps forward, his boots clicking against marble with deliberate precision. 20 feet, 15, 10. His finger finds the trigger as sweat beads on his forehead, despite the morning's relative coolness. The revolver's weight seems to increase with each step, as if the weapon itself understands the magnitude of what's about to unfold. But why does Guiteau hesitate even now, in these final seconds before irreversible action? The answer lies in the assassin's fractured psyche, where delusions of divine mission war with flickering moments of human doubt. Guiteau has convinced himself that Arthur, the stalwart vice president, will reward him for removing the half-breed obstacle to party unity. In his twisted logic, murder becomes patriotic duty. 9:25. Garfield turns slightly, perhaps sensing movement behind him. For an instant, predator and prey lock eyes across the crowded station floor. The president's expression shifts from mild curiosity to dawning alarm, but recognition comes too late. Guiteau raises his weapon with surprising steadiness. "I am a stalwart, and Arthur is now president." The words explode from his throat like a battle cry as his finger squeezes the trigger. The first shot cracks through the station's morning calm, with the sharp finality of breaking bone. The bullet tears through Garfield's right arm, spinning him slightly as passengers scream and scatter like startled birds. Blood spatters across his dark coat sleeve, but the president remains upright, his eyes wide with shock rather than pain. How can a man shot at point-blank range still stand and think clearly? The second shot follows barely a heartbeat later, its report echoing off marble walls like thunder in a cathedral. This bullet finds its mark with devastating precision, punching through Garfield's back near his right shoulder blade and beginning a journey deep into his torso that will not end for 79 days. The impact drives him to his knees, then forward onto the unforgiving stone floor. Chaos erupts around the fallen president. Blaine drops to his knees beside his friend, pressing his hands against wounds that pump bright arterial blood onto marble already slick with morning moisture. Passengers stampede toward exits, their screams mixing with the acrid smell of gunpowder that now hangs in the summer air like incense in a house of worship. Guiteau makes no attempt to flee. Instead, he stands over his victim with the smoking revolver still in his hand, his face radiant with the satisfaction of a job completed. It is done, he announces to no one in particular, as if commenting on the weather or the arrival of a delayed train. Within minutes, police officers swarm the station, their heavy boots pounding against marble as they surround the assassin. Guiteau surrenders his weapon without resistance, already composing in his mind the speech he will deliver to grateful Republicans who must surely understand his noble sacrifice. But as President Garfield's blood continues to spread across the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad station floor, one terrible question haunts everyone present. Will America's 20th president survive to see another sunrise? Blood pools beneath President Garfield's motionless form as you watch Dr. Smith Townsend kneel beside him, pressing his ear to the wounded man's chest, listening for the faint rhythm that separates life from death. This moment begins the most documented medical catastrophe in American presidential history. The station clock reads 9:35 when Dr. Townsend arrives, his black medical bag clutched in hands that have seen too many gunshot wounds during his Civil War service. Garfield lies on his left side, conscious but pale, his breathing shallow and rapid. Blood continues to seep from both wounds, creating dark stains that spread across his traveling clothes like spilled ink on expensive paper. "Mr. President, can you hear me?" Townsend's voice carries the practiced calm of a battlefield surgeon, but his eyes betray growing concern as he examines the damage. The arm wound appears superficial, a graze that has already stopped bleeding significantly. The back wound tells a different story entirely. Garfield's lips move with obvious effort. "I am in great pain," he whispers, each word requiring visible concentration. Lower down. His right hand makes a weak gesture toward his abdomen, where the second bullet has begun its destructive journey through his torso. Secretary Blaine hovers nearby, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled from kneeling in his friend's blood. "James, help is coming," he murmurs, though his voice wavers with uncertainty. Around them, police officers have cordoned off the area, their faces grim as they witness the unthinkable America's commander-in-chief bleeding on a public floor like any common victim of violence. What thoughts race through a president's mind as he lies shot in a railway station? Garfield's consciousness drifts between sharp awareness and merciful detachment. He thinks of Lucretia, his beloved wife, recovering from malaria at their New Jersey cottage. She must not hear of this from strangers. His children's faces flash through his mind. Harry, James, Molly, Irvin, and little Abram. How will they understand that their father's dedication to public service has made him a target for madness? Dr. Townsend continues his examination with growing urgency. The bullet wound in Garfield's back presents a small, neat hole, surrounded by powder burns that indicate close-range firing. But where has the projectile traveled? His fingers probe gently around the entry point, feeling for obvious internal damage. But the president's heavy clothing and the awkward position make thorough assessment impossible. "We must move him to proper facilities," Townsend announces to the gathering crowd of officials. "He cannot receive adequate care here." The decision seems obvious, yet it marks the beginning of a transportation ordeal that will test Garfield's failing strength to its limits. Police have cleared a path to the street, where carriages wait to convey the wounded president back to the White House. The journey that should take 15 minutes stretches into an eternity of jolting wheels and groaning springs that send waves of agony through Garfield's damaged torso. Each bump in Washington's rutted streets drives the bullet deeper into tissue that was never meant to accommodate foreign metal. Garfield remains conscious throughout the agonizing ride, his fingers gripping the carriage seat with white-knuckled intensity. Sweat beads on his forehead despite the morning's moderate temperature, and his breathing grows increasingly labored. Dr. Townsend maintains pressure on the back wound, but blood continues to seep between his fingers with each heartbeat. Why does the human body fight so desperately to preserve life, even when death might offer mercy? The White House comes into view like a sanctuary emerging from a nightmare, its familiar white columns and manicured grounds offering the promise of safety and proper medical care. But appearances deceive. The executive mansion's medical facilities remain primitive by contemporary standards, lacking even basic surgical equipment that might save a president's life. Servants have prepared the president's bedroom on the second floor, transforming the space into a makeshift hospital ward. Fresh linens cover the large bed, while basins of hot water and clean towels wait on nearby tables. The summer air hangs heavy and still, made worse by the closed windows that protocol demands for security reasons. Dr. Townsend is joined by Dr. Willard Bliss, whose confident arrival masks a dangerous arrogance that will prove far more lethal than Guiteau's bullets. Bliss sweeps into the room with the self-assurance of Washington's most prominent physician, his reputation built on social connections rather than medical innovation. His first decision reveals everything about the ordeal to come. "We must locate that bullet immediately," Bliss declares, already rolling up his sleeves. Proper examination requires thorough exploration of the wound tract. His unwashed hands hover over instruments that have never seen Joseph Lister's revolutionary antiseptic techniques, tools that will soon carry death deeper into the president's body than any assassin's bullet. Garfield watches from his bed as the doctors prepare their examination, unaware that the real torture is only beginning. His eyes seek the windows where afternoon sunlight streams through lace curtains, perhaps wondering if he will live to see another Washington sunset. The question haunting everyone in the room remains unspoken but undeniable. Will the cure prove more deadly than the wound? Dr. Bliss thrusts his unwashed finger deep into President Garfield's wound, probing blindly through torn flesh, while you watch the leader of the free world bite down on leather to muffle his screams. This moment transforms a survivable injury into a death sentence written in septic ink. July 3rd, 1881. The president's bedroom has become a chamber of medieval torture disguised as modern medicine. Dr. Willard Bliss stands over his patient with the confidence of a man who has never doubted his own expertise, despite mounting evidence that his methods belong in the Dark Ages rather than the enlightened 1880s. Garfield's face contorts in agony as Bliss forces his index finger deeper into the bullet wound, searching for the projectile with all the delicacy of a blacksmith working iron. The president's hands grip the bedsheets with such force that his knuckles have turned bone white, and sweat pours from his brow despite the room's relative coolness. "I can feel something hard," Bliss announces with satisfaction, seemingly oblivious to his patient's suffering. The bullet cannot be far. His finger withdraws momentarily, bringing with it fresh blood and fragments of cloth that the projectile had driven into the wound channel. Without pausing to clean his hands or instruments, he selects a long metal probe from his surgical kit. The instruments gleam with deceptive cleanliness in the afternoon sunlight, but their surfaces harbor invisible armies of bacteria that will prove more deadly than Guiteau's bullets. Bliss has dismissed the radical theories of Joseph Lister, the British surgeon whose antiseptic techniques are revolutionizing medicine across Europe. Such foreign innovations seem unnecessary to a physician whose reputation rests on Washington's social circles rather than scientific advancement. Why would America's most prominent doctor reject methods that could save his most important patient? Arrogance blinds Bliss to the microscopic warfare already beginning inside Garfield's body. The repeated probing has introduced bacteria deep into tissue that was previously sterile, creating ideal conditions for the infections that will soon ravage the president's organs. Each insertion of dirty instruments carries more contamination, while Bliss interprets Garfield's mounting fever as a natural healing response rather than the first symptom of septic disaster. The metal probe slides into the wound with a sound like steel cutting raw meat. Garfield's back arches involuntarily as the instrument penetrates deeper than any finger could reach, scraping against ribs and organs with mechanical precision. His breathing becomes rapid and shallow, punctuated by involuntary gasps that echo through the hushed room. "Hold still, Mr. President," Bliss commands, as if willpower alone could overcome the body's instinctive recoil from invasion. "We must map the bullet's path precisely." The probe continues its destructive journey, widening the wound channel and creating new passages for infection to spread throughout Garfield's torso. Dr. Townsend watches from across the room, his own medical training warring with deference to Bliss's superior reputation. He notices the president's increasing pallor and the way pain has etched new lines around his eyes, but protocol prevents him from questioning his senior colleague's methods. The hierarchy of Washington medicine demands silence, even as it witnesses potential murder disguised as treatment. Garfield's wife Lucretia arrives that evening, her face drawn with exhaustion from her own recent illness and the terrifying train journey from New Jersey. She takes her place beside the bed, holding her husband's hand while doctors continue their relentless examination. The sight of the woman he loves gives Garfield strength to endure another round of probing, though his grip on her fingers grows weaker with each passing hour. "James," she whispers, "you must get well. The children need their father." Her voice carries the desperate hope of a woman watching her world collapse in real time. She has already survived the deaths of 2 children. Losing her husband to an assassin's bullet seems too cruel for any god to allow. How many times can the human body endure violation before it simply surrenders? By July 4th, America's centennial celebration proceeds with subdued patriotism, while their president fights for life just blocks from the festivities. Fireworks explode over Washington like distant artillery, their echoes reaching Garfield's sick room where he lies increasingly delirious with mounting fever. The irony seems lost on celebrating crowds. Independence Day, marked by their leader's imprisonment in his own failing flesh. Dr. Bliss continues his examinations with mechanical regularity, inserting probes and fingers into the wound multiple times daily. Each exploration brings fresh blood and growing signs of infection, yet he interprets these symptoms as progress rather than impending disaster. The wound edges have begun to blacken with necrotic tissue, while pus forms in the deepest recesses where bacteria multiply unchecked. Garfield's temperature climbs steadily, reaching 103 degrees Fahrenheit by the week's end. His moments of lucidity grow shorter and less frequent, interrupted by periods of rambling delirium, where he speaks to long-dead comrades from his Civil War regiment, The strong voice that once commanded audiences across the nation now emerges as barely audible whispers. Yet Dr. Bliss remains convinced that aggressive intervention will locate the bullet and save his patient's life. He has ordered additional surgical instruments from Philadelphia, including longer probes that can reach deeper into Garfield's torso. The president's body has become a battlefield where pride wars against science, with death keeping careful score. As July surrenders to August, one question haunts everyone in the executive mansion. How much more exploration can a human body survive before the cure becomes indistinguishable from the disease? The nauseating stench of putrefying flesh fills President Garfield's bedroom as you watch Dr. Bliss prepare another rectal feeding tube, convinced that nourishing the dying man through his bowels will somehow reverse the septic catastrophe consuming him alive. This desperate measure reveals how completely medical science has failed America's commander-in-chief. August 15th, 1881. The president's once robust frame has withered to a skeletal shadow of its former strength, his weight plummeting from 210 pounds to barely 160 in just 6 weeks. His face has taken on the waxy pallor of approaching death, while his eyes sink deeper into their sockets with each passing day. The strong jaw that once projected presidential authority now appears sharp and angular, stretched over bones that seem too large for the flesh that barely covers them. Dr. Bliss examines his latest innovation with the pride of a man convinced he has discovered medical salvation. The rubber tube gleams wetly in the afternoon light, streaming through the bedroom windows, its length coiled like a serpent waiting to strike. Beside it, a ceramic bowl contains the noxious mixture that will supposedly sustain live beef broth, raw egg yolks, and liberal doses of opium to ease the president's constant agony. This method has shown promise in similar cases, Bliss announces to the assembled medical team, though none present can recall any case remotely similar to their current predicament. The technique of rectal feeding represents desperation, masquerading as innovation, a procedure that will cause more suffering than it could possibly prevent. Garfield watches the preparations with the detached fascination of a man who has grown accustomed to having his body treated as a medical experiment. The constant probing has continued relentlessly over 40 separate examinations by various physicians, each convinced they might succeed where others have failed. His back wound now gapes like a suppurating mouth, its edges black with necrotic tissue that reeks of decay despite constant cleaning. Why does hope persist even when reason demands surrender? The president's abdomen has become a landscape of infection, with multiple abscesses forming throughout his torso, like underground rivers of pus. His liver, once healthy and strong, now harbors pockets of corruption that send toxins coursing through his bloodstream with every heartbeat. His lungs struggle against similar invasions, their capacity diminished by inflammation that makes each breath a conscious effort. Lucretia maintains her vigil beside the bed, her own health deteriorating from exhaustion and emotional strain. She has witnessed her husband's transformation from vibrant leader to skeletal invalid, watching helplessly as each medical intervention seems to accelerate his decline rather than arrest it. Her presence provides the only comfort in Garfield's world of constant pain, though even her gentle touch now causes him to wince. "Try to rest, dearest," she whispers, smoothing his sweat-dampened hair with fingers that tremble from their own exhaustion. "You must conserve your strength, but strength has become a finite resource that diminishes with each breath, each heartbeat, each futile attempt to nourish a body that can no longer process sustenance through conventional means." The rectal feeding begins with clinical precision that masks its fundamental horror. Dr. Bliss inserts the tube with the practiced confidence of a man who has convinced himself that desperation equals expertise. The mixture flows slowly into Garfield's bowel, carrying with it the hopes of physicians who refuse to acknowledge that their patient is dying despite their efforts rather than because of his wounds. Garfield's body rejects this assault with violent spasms that rack his weakened frame. The foreign nutrition causes immediate distress, creating painful cramps that add to his existing agony while providing minimal actual nourishment. His digestive system, already compromised by weeks of infection and medication, cannot process the alien sustenance being forced upon it. How many indignities can human dignity endure before it simply ceases to exist? The political world continues to function around Garfield's deathbed, though major decisions remain suspended in the constitutional limbo created by his incapacitation. Vice President Chester Arthur maintains his careful distance, refusing to assume executive authority without clear legal precedent. The nation's business stagnates while lawyers debate succession protocols that no one ever expected to need. Meanwhile, Charles Guiteau sits in his cell, writing rambling letters to prominent Republicans who he still believes will thank him for his patriotic service. His delusions remain intact, even as newspapers chronicle his victims' prolonged suffering. The assassin's lawyer prepares an insanity defense, while Guiteau himself demands payment for services rendered to the stalwart cause. Dr. Bliss persists with his examinations despite mounting evidence that each probe introduces more contamination into wounds that will never heal. The presidential bedroom has become a charnel house disguised as a medical facility, where the smell of antiseptic cannot mask the underlying stench of rotting flesh. Servants change bedding multiple times daily, yet the odor of approaching death permeates everything. August surrenders to September with Garfield barely clinging to consciousness, his body sustained more by morphine than by any will to live. The rectal feeding continues despite its obvious failure, while new abscesses form faster than existing ones can drain. His physicians maintain their optimistic pronouncements to the press, while privately acknowledging that their patient cannot survive much longer. As autumn approaches with its promise of cooler weather, one desperate question drives every decision in the executive mansion. Could a change of environment succeed where medical science has so catastrophically failed? The screech of metal wheels against railroad tracks mingles with President Garfield's labored breathing as you watch workers lay specially cushioned rails from Washington to the New Jersey coast, a desperate gambit to save a dying man through seaside air. This final journey will either restore America's president or provide him a more dignified place to die. September 6th, 1881. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad has transformed its coastal line into a medical corridor, with engineers working through the night to smooth every bump and grade that might jar their precious cargo. Fresh ballast fills gaps between ties, while maintenance crews polish rails to mirror brightness, eliminating imperfections that could translate into agony for their presidential passenger. Dr. Bliss stands beside the specially modified rail car, inspecting accommodations that represent the pinnacle of 19th century medical transport. The interior has been gutted and rebuilt as a mobile hospital room, complete with a spring-mounted bed designed to absorb the inevitable shocks of rail travel. Silk curtains filter the harsh sunlight, while hidden compartments hold medical supplies and the increasingly powerful doses of morphine required to keep Garfield conscious. The president's condition has deteriorated so severely that moving him seems tantamount to murder. Yet remaining in Washington's suffocating heat appears equally fatal. His weight has dropped to barely 130 pounds, transforming the once robust leader into a skeletal caricature of presidential authority. Multiple abscesses drain constantly through tubes inserted into his back, creating a nauseating cocktail of pus and blood that soaks through bandages faster than servants can change them. The sea air will restore his strength. Bliss insists to skeptical colleagues who privately wonder if their patient will survive the 6-hour journey. Coastal climates have proven beneficial for consumptive patients, but Garfield suffers from sepsis, not tuberculosis, and no amount of salt breeze can cleanse the corruption, spreading through his internal organs like spilled poison. Why do desperate men cling to hope, even when logic demands acceptance of inevitable defeat? The transfer from the White House to the waiting train requires elaborate choreography worthy of a state funeral. 6 strong men lift Garfield's stretcher with glacial slowness, each step coordinated to minimize jarring movements that could trigger new waves of agony. The president remains semi-conscious throughout the ordeal, his eyes rolling beneath closed lids as morphine battles pain for control of his nervous system. Lucretia walks beside the stretcher, her face a mask of composed grief that barely conceals the terror eating at her soul. She has watched her husband waste away for over 2 months, witnessing his transformation from vigorous leader to dying invalid with the helpless fury of someone watching a beloved ship sink beyond rescue. Her presence provides comfort to Garfield even in his drugged stupor, though she knows this journey may be their last together. The specially cushioned railcar gleams in the morning sunlight like a funeral hearse disguised as luxury transport. Its wheels have been wrapped in leather to reduce vibration, while the entire undercarriage rides on experimental springs designed to smooth the roughest terrain. Despite these innovations, the basic physics of rail travel remain unchanged. Every curve, every grade change, every imperfection in the roadbed will transmit its violence directly into Garfield's failing body. The journey begins with deceptive gentleness as the train pulls away from Washington's Union Station at barely walking speed. Engineers have received strict orders to maintain minimal velocity, turning what should be a 4-hour trip into an extended ordeal of gradual progress. The locomotive's whistle sounds mournfully as it carries America's dying president toward his final appointment with destiny. Inside the modified car, Dr. Bliss monitors his patient's vital signs with growing alarm. Garfield's pulse races irregularly, while his breathing becomes increasingly shallow and rapid. The morphine that dulls his pain also depresses his respiratory system, creating a dangerous balance between consciousness and suffocation. Each mile of track brings new evidence that this journey may kill the very man it was designed to save. How can forward movement feel so much like retreat in the face of approaching death? The train's gentle swaying triggers violent spasms in Garfield's infected wounds, causing fresh bleeding that quickly saturates his bandages. Dr. Bliss works frantically to replace dressings while maintaining pressure on drainage tubes that threaten to dislodge with every movement. The car's silk curtains filter sunlight into a golden haze that makes the scene appear almost ethereal, disguising the medical horror unfolding within. Garfield drifts between delirium and moments of startling clarity, his consciousness rising and falling like a ship struggling against overwhelming waves. During lucid intervals, he recognizes Lucretia's voice and attempts to squeeze her hand, though his grip has weakened to that of a small child. His lips move constantly, forming silent words that might be prayers or final messages to children who may never see their father alive again. The locomotive reaches the New Jersey coastline as afternoon shadows begin to lengthen, its whistle announcing the arrival of presidential tragedy. To crowds gathered along the route, thousands of Americans line the tracks, their faces reflecting the mixture of hope and dread that has gripped the nation for over 2 months. They watch the slow-moving train pass with the reverence normally reserved for funeral processions. The Elberon Hotel emerges from coastal mists, like a palace designed for convalescence, its broad verandas and ocean-facing windows promising the restorative powers of sea, air, and salt breezes. Hotel staff have transformed the building's finest suite into a hospital room, while physicians from New York and Philadelphia arrive to consult on this most famous patient. Everyone clings to the desperate hope that change of environment might succeed where medical science has failed so completely. But as evening approaches and Garfield is transferred to his seaside sick room, one terrible question haunts everyone present. Has this elaborate journey simply provided a more scenic backdrop for inevitable tragedy? Ocean waves crash against the New Jersey shore as you watch President Garfield's sunken eyes flutter open for what may be the final time, his lips forming silent words while death circles closer with each labored breath. This seaside vigil will determine whether America's 20th president dies as a martyr or merely as medicine's most prominent failure. September 10th, 1881. The Elberon Hotel's presidential suite overlooks the Atlantic Ocean, where autumn swells roll endlessly toward shore with hypnotic rhythm that seems to match Garfield's increasingly irregular heartbeat. Salt air streams through open windows, carrying the clean scent of seaweed and distant storms. Yet, even this oceanic purity cannot mask the sickly sweet odor of decay that emanates from the president's failing body. For 3 miraculous days, the change of environment appears to work its promised magic. Garfield's fever drops slightly, and his periods of consciousness extend long enough for coherent conversation with Lucretia and his closest advisors. Color returns to his cheeks, not the healthy flush of recovery, but the hectic brightness that often precedes death's final assault. Still, hope blooms in the hearts of those who have watched him suffer for over 2 months. The ocean reminds me of our early days in Ohio. Garfield whispers to his wife during one lucid moment, his voice barely audible above the distant surf. "Do you remember the lake cottage where we honeymooned?" Lucretia forces a smile through tears that threaten to betray her composed facade, knowing that such memories often signal a dying mind's retreat to happier times. Dr. Bliss maintains his optimistic pronouncements to the press, describing the president's condition as markedly improved, despite private observations that suggest otherwise. The physician's reputation now depends entirely on Garfield's survival, and admitting failure would destroy not only his career, but his fundamental belief in his own medical expertise. Pride has become a more powerful drug than any opium derivative in his black leather bag. Why do men persist in self-deception, even when death provides irrefutable evidence of their limitations? The hotel's staff moves through the suite with funeral silence, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets that absorb sound like grave earth. Fresh flowers arrive daily from well-wishers across the nation, their fragrance a desperate attempt to combat the increasingly overwhelming smell of suppuration that no amount of perfume can disguise. Servants change bedding every few hours, yet the linens emerge stained with fluids that speak of internal catastrophe beyond medical remedy. September 15th brings ominous changes that even Bliss cannot ignore. Garfield's temperature spikes to dangerous levels, while his pulse becomes rapid and thready, fluttering like a trapped bird beneath skin that has taken on a waxy, yellowish hue. The drainage from his back wounds increases dramatically, producing quantities of pus that suggest massive internal abscesses have begun rupturing into his body cavity. The president's abdomen distends visibly as infection spreads throughout his peritoneum, creating a reservoir of poison that circulates with every heartbeat. His breathing becomes labored and shallow, punctuated by occasional gasps that echo through the hushed sick room like death rattles. Morphine can no longer control his pain, and consciousness becomes a burden rather than a blessing. Lucretia maintains her vigil beside the bed, holding her husband's skeletal hand while watching his life ebb away with each labored breath. Their children have been summoned from across the country, arriving one by one to witness their father's final hours. The sight of his older sons, young men who remembered him as a tower of strength, struggling to recognize the wasted figure in the bed, proves almost too much for Garfield's remaining awareness to bear. What thoughts occupy a dying president's mind as he prepares to surrender the most powerful office on Earth? September 18th dawns grey and stormy, with ocean waves crashing against the shore, with unusual violence that seems to mirror the chaos consuming Garfield's internal organs. His heart, weakened by months of fighting systemic infection, begins to fail as abscesses rupture into his bloodstream, like poison bombs exploding in slow motion. Each pulse sends fresh contamination, coursing through arteries and veins that can no longer filter toxins from life-sustaining blood. Dr. Bliss finally abandons his aggressive treatments, recognizing that further intervention would be tantamount to torture. The president lies still as death, his breathing so shallow that observers must lean close to detect signs of life. His eyes remain closed, sunken deep into sockets that have become cavernous hollows in a face stretched tight over prominent bones. The hotel's telegraph office sends constant updates to a nation holding its collective breath, each bulletin more ominous than the last. Crowds gather in churches and town squares, praying for a miracle that medical science has proven unable to provide. The irony seems lost on most observers. America's most technologically advanced treatment has killed its patient more surely than any assassin's bullet. As evening approaches on September 19th, Garfield's breathing becomes increasingly irregular, with long pauses between breaths that suggest his tired heart can no longer maintain its vital rhythm. Lucretia leans close to whisper final words of love, while their children gather around the bed like mourners at an altar. The ocean waves continue their eternal rhythm outside the windows, indifferent to human suffering, as America's president prepares to join the countless souls who have surrendered to forces beyond mortal control. The grandfather clock in President Garfield's room chimes 10:30 as you watch his chest rise and fall with mechanical precision, each breath numbered among his final dozen on this earth. This moment will end not just a presidency, but an era of American innocence about the healing power of medical science. September 19th, 1881. Outside the Elberon Hotel, autumn storms lash the New Jersey coastline with unprecedented fury, as if nature itself mourns the approaching loss of America's commander-in-chief. Lightning illuminates the presidential suite in stark, intermittent flashes that cast dancing shadows across walls, where the nation's most powerful man lies dying despite the best efforts of 19th century medicine. Dr. Bliss stands helplessly beside the bed, his earlier confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed exhaustion of a man watching his reputation die alongside his patient. For 79 days, he has proclaimed that aggressive treatment would save the president's life. Now, as Garfield's heart struggles against the septic poison coursing through his bloodstream, even Bliss cannot deny the approaching end. Lucretia maintains her vigil with the composed dignity that has defined her throughout this ordeal. Though tears flow silently down, cheeks worn thin by months of sleepless anxiety, her hand rests lightly on her husband's skeletal arm, providing what comfort touch can offer to a man whose body has become a battlefield where death claims victory inch by agonizing inch. The president's breathing grows increasingly erratic, with pauses that stretch longer than seems humanly possible before his chest rises again in defiant continuation of life's most basic function. His pulse flutters weakly beneath skin that has taken on the waxy pallor of approaching dissolution, while his sunken eyes remain closed against a world that has become too painful to observe. "James," Lucretia whispers, her voice barely audible above the storm raging outside. "The children are here. Harry and Molly want to say goodbye." But Garfield shows no sign of hearing, his consciousness having retreated to some private place where pain cannot follow and love becomes memory. How does a heart know when to surrender its burden of keeping blood flowing through dying flesh? 10:35. The moment arrives with devastating suddenness after hours of gradual decline. Garfield's chest rises one final time, holds briefly as if gathering strength for another breath, then settles into permanent stillness. The irregular rhythm that has marked time for 79 days simply stops, leaving only the sound of rain against windows and Lucretia's choked sob breaking the awful silence. Dr. Bliss places his stethoscope against the president's chest, searching desperately for any sound of continuing life, but finds only the profound quiet that follows when a human heart admits defeat. At exactly 10:35 on the evening of September 19th, 1881, James Abram Garfield, 20th President of the United States, Civil War hero and loving father, surrenders to forces beyond presidential power to command. The irony proves more bitter than any medicine Bliss has administered throughout this ordeal. The autopsy, performed 24 hours later, will reveal that Guiteau's bullet caused no immediately fatal damage. The projectile rests harmlessly behind Garfield's pancreas, encased in protective tissue that had prevented internal bleeding. A competent surgeon using sterile techniques could have saved the president's life with relative ease. Instead, the repeated probing with unwashed hands and unsterilized instruments created the infections that killed him. Dr. Bliss, in his arrogant rejection of antiseptic practices, had accomplished what Charles Guiteau's bullets could not: the murder of America's president through medical malpractice disguised as healing. The telegraph keys begin clicking immediately, carrying news of presidential death across a continent that has held its breath for over 2 months. In Washington, Vice President Chester Arthur receives the message while pacing his residence, finally free to assume the authority he has carefully avoided claiming. The constitutional crisis ends not through legal precedent, but through biological certainty. Death resolves all questions of succession. What does it mean for a nation when its leader dies not from an assassin's bullets, but from his doctor's ignorance? Churches across America toll their bells in mourning while newspaper presses prepare black-bordered editions announcing the end of presidency number 20. Crowds gather in town squares and city centers, their faces reflecting the mixture of grief and rage that accompanies preventable tragedy. The public's faith in medical expertise never absolute suffers a blow from which it may never fully recover. Charles Guiteau, still confined in his Washington cell, learns of his victim's death with twisted satisfaction. He immediately begins composing letters demanding payment for services rendered to the Republican Party, his delusional mind interpreting Garfield's death as vindication of his patriotic duty.